Well, thank you everyone so much for coming out. I know that this is meant to be a relaxing time, some decompressing. I'm sure everyone has had a very busy climate week. So I think we just really wanted to take this time to sort of reflect and have a really casual conversation about the future of podcasting. And this is kind of a live podcasting event, which is really cool. So thank you to the panelists for being here. I know it's been a really, really busy week. So thank you so much for your time and your energy. Thank you, Kiana, for reaching out and wanting to collaborate. This is super exciting. So with that, I'll pass it over to Kiana.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Deanna. I'll reiterate a little bit of what you said, but appreciate you all being here on a rainy Sunday. It's been an incredible climate week, and I know we're all a little bit tired. I am losing my voice a teeny bit, although it sounds better than yesterday, so you might hear that. Thanks for bearing with me. And really excited to have this cozy conversation with you all. Deanna and I were chatting about podcasting and climate podcasting and had this idea to bring this conversation to you during Climate Week. And I am thrilled to be joined by incredible podcast hosts and leaders in the climate justice space. And we are going to chat about the impact of podcasting and storytelling specifically to further climate action and climate justice. And so excited to get into this. With that, I'm going to pass it to each of you to introduce yourself, or actually let me introduce myself a little more first. I'm Kiana Michaan, and I host a podcast called Climate with Kiana, which I started last year. And I also work in the solar and climate justice space and am passionate about climate storytelling. And I am joined by, truly, I'm deeply inspired by all of your work. So I will pass it to each of you to introduce yourself, the podcast that you host, and a little bit also about your broader work in the climate justice space. Aiko, feel free to kick us off.
Is this on? Am I on? All right. Good to see everyone today. Again, Deanna and Kiana, thanks so much for organizing this. My name is Aiko Schaefer. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director of Just Solutions, and I'm the host of the podcast Just Solutions Podcast. And so we really look at solutions at the intersection, or I should say we look at equitable and just solutions, hence the name, and really bring forward people who are out in the world making things happen, people who are experts in research, policy, just to help us all not only be able to replicate and identify good solutions, but to hopefully be inspired and figure out how to do those things in our own communities.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Arielle King. I'm an environmental justice educator and strategist, and I'm the host of the Joy Report podcast through Intersectional Environmentalist. It is a podcast all about positive climate solutions grounded in intersectionality and environmental justice. We kind of came into this work, and I feel like we'll get into this a bit more, but out of a desire to combat climate doomism and the fear and anxiety that is all wrapped up into what could happen if we don't take action. And so like trying to create a clear antidote and clear accessible ways that our listeners can get involved in the climate movement to be able to contribute to collective action. And yeah, so it's a little about me. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. I'm saying to clear my throat. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristy Drutman. I am the host and founder of the Brown Girl Green podcast. I'm also known on social media as Brown Girl Green. It's been a long climate week, so please know that on the podcast, my voice does not sound this raspy, but it is maybe a decibel lower raspy. And I would say that my show is really focused about my journey as a young woman of color, kind of learning about how to take action on the climate crisis. And I do that through interviews with incredible Black and Brown leaders primarily to learn about the climate solutions that they're leading in their communities and around the world, with the hope that, I'm also inspiring a lot of, inspiration and solutions and positivity to invest in the next generation and want to take action on the climate crisis.
Amazing. And I'm Diana. I am the host of Palma. The podcast really originated from wanting to talk about climate and culture as well as storytelling. And I try and elevate Latin female voices in the climate space. And really it came out, the genesis was during my master's. I felt really inspired by taking conversations out of the classroom and continuing to hold space for everything from, fashion to should we have kids when it comes to thinking about the climate crisis and just everything wrapped up in how climate change is affecting our lives. So really excited to be here and thank you guys so much.
Amazing. I want to hear more about, you've each shared a little bit about your shows, but for those who haven't listened, I think a little bit more about what inspired you to start the show. And I think what's really beautiful is that each of your shows have really unique, distinctive styles and voices. And just having more voices of women of color, I think leading storytelling and climate education is so important. So could you share a little bit more about the style of how you approach storytelling and sharing through your shows, and how you feel that your podcast supports your broader climate work as well?
I can start. So, Brown Girl Green came out of, I was actually just talking about this earlier, it came out of a school project. It was like my last semester of college at UC Berkeley. And I realized I just really wanted to feature the voices of more people of color leading in the climate space. I felt really frustrated at that point that I just didn't see many people who look like me in the space. And on top of that, I just figured maybe interviewing experts in the space could maybe lead me to finding my first job. So I kind of used it as a networking tool, to be honest with you, because I was told that podcasting could be a way that you could either get clients or you could, find a mentor. And I was told those are all good things when you're finishing college. So for full transparency, I was I want to learn, but I also was maybe I can get a job out of this. And so I was interviewing really incredible folks that were leading DEI efforts specifically. So I was looking for who is the DEI person at every environmental organization that I really admired. And I just cold called, emailed them, and just wanted to see would anyone be interested in talking about why is diversity and inclusion important in the environmental space. And that's kind of how it started out, was talking about what are the strategies your organization is doing? How are you addressing it? And then it evolved over time from it being just about JEDI or justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion to then actually being well, what if we dove deeper into the actual stories of people's lives instead of just how organizations could shift? And so I'd say the show kind of transformed into me going into a journey of wanting to interview different leaders in this space on, how did you get into this work, but also what sustains you in the work? Why is your solution one people should know about? And kind of just wanting to interview people about things that I didn't know about. And really making sure that my interview style format was talking to people in a way that a 5 to 10-year-old could understand it. And so in my show, I make a point that if I interview a guest, if they say a term or an acronym, I make sure they define it. I make sure that they say what that is. And if it doesn't make sense to me, I say it in pretty layman's terms. I don't act oh, I know what you said. If I don't get it, I'll be wait, what does that mean? Or can you rephrase that? Because I know that's what listeners probably are also processing as they're learning the information. So like I said a second ago, my show is really about making it really accessible to talk about really dense, kind of difficult topics related to climate and how to make sure that voices of color are prioritized in that.
So I was approached to host my podcast. So the organization Intersectional Environmentalist, they were seeking opportunities to expand out their environmental education work. And so all they had at the time was a name for the for the podcast and an idea that it was going to be about positive climate solutions. And so when they approached me, it just made sense, and it really aligned with, I guess, my general ethos as I approach the world. I believe that joy is a choice, and it's an opportunity for us to build community and to reimagine the world in a more loving and heart-centered, compassionate way, and to seek solutions that are grounded and guided by people of color. And so the Joy Report is a scripted podcast. We don't do interviews so far in what we're producing. And in this scripted podcast, I always make sure to add context to whatever the solutions are. And so each episode is focused on one particular solution, and the main story always showcases a solution that is driven by a person or community or organization of color, to showcase the fact that solutions already exist to combat the climate crisis. They generally just need to be scaled up, and we need to redistribute resources and funding in a way that is more equitable to create the solutions that we so desperately need. So yeah.
So we're at this, I think, very interesting moment in time where we are seeing our policymakers begin to really pass laws to address climate injustice. And you're seeing that here in the US, obviously conversations that are moving along internationally. And at the same time, we have more and more scientists and researchers who are BIPOC and BIPOC women. And so the creation of Just Solutions as a national organization was really to begin to provide and coalesce our understanding of what those solutions are that were created for community by community. And so what are those policy designs? What is the leading research out there? And to be able to support communities on the ground to have the assistance they need to be stronger advocates. And so the podcast was a real natural extension of that. And so a lot of what the purpose of this show is, selfishly, I get to do the show. So as the executive director, I get to have some fun talking about the topics and programs and to be inspired by the guests. But really, it's, to me personally, I think my interest in doing this is that when you think about who the climate expert is, I think that people do think about white male scientists. And for me, those shows, when I can bring a Black woman climate scientist that's working in Mississippi, or to be able to find someone who has been, advocating in their state capitals to really pass amazing progressive policy change, or to take decisions that have been made in Washington, D.C. and really help people understand, well, what does that mean for your community? How is that impact going to actually happen? So I think it's really both trying to elevate a different person as who is the expert, right? Who is a climate expert, but to also bring that information so that people who are listening can think about how they could actually replicate those ideas and how they might actually construct them. And ultimately, because there's a nonprofit connected to it, that allows them to find people. Our staff as a national policy and research organization is majority BIPOC. We have a lot of, majority of our staff grew up in environmental justice communities. A lot of them are first generation college students who have advanced degrees, PhDs, master's degrees, law degrees, who are able to bring both that lived experience and that traditional academic training, combined with our partnership and work that we're doing with communities all across the country. So it's just a way for us as an organization to also advance our resources and to be able to elevate the sense that there are lots and lots of climate experts out there, and that we think that that expertise, first and foremost, has to come from community and has to be led by community.
Yeah, I would love to come back to that because there's so much richness in what everyone has said here. I think one of the things that we've been sort of talking about is who gets to tell those stories, especially in podcasting, because as small independent podcasts, sometimes you're allowed to have the conversations that in other podcasts they might, stay away from, depending on, who's funding, or there's more of a crafting of the narrative. And so I think what's really important is being able to tell the stories that oftentimes aren't really seen. And I've seen that within my own work of diving deeper, because I've been astounded through some of the work that I've done at how many people are in the climate space. Like sometimes it feels like you're in this bubble, but a lot of times there's so many people that are doing the work. And so being able to elevate those voices is really amazing. So, but
I want to dig deeper into many things that were just said. I think what's incredible about podcasting as a medium is it's the democratization of access to information through the internet, and anyone can start a podcast, which is great, but also not great sometimes. And, there's, I think, over like 135 monthly listeners of podcasts in the US, and listenership is going up among young people, among people of color. So it is an incredible tool to reach people. My question is, how do you combat misinformation and disinformation, which is already so kind of rampant in the climate space, and then even within the podcasting space, right? Credibility. I know some of your shows are tied directly to organizations, which, but yeah, kind of the responsibility of storytelling when you're bringing perspectives that are not often uplifted in a space in which it's hard to have these voices and stories heard. How are you thinking about that sort of in the process? I know, so it's a big question, but.
Yeah, I feel like as someone who maybe like considers myself an expert in fields, like I believe in citing my sources, right? And I believe that like it is my duty to tell the truth, right? And Kimberly Crenshaw talks about how we are in the midst of a war on truth right now, like where there is like this like onslaught of like misinformation and information that is like actively seeking to oppose truth and fact. And I think it is our responsibility and our duty to combat that with our words, with the platforms that we have built. And so like the way that we do that through the Joy Report is we do very extensive research ahead of each episode. That's partially because it is scripted, right? So like we want to be able to tell a full story and to consider the perspectives and the pushback that we might receive from listeners if we're like voicing an opinion that might be new. And so I think it's like really important in my work as a podcaster to just be grounded in truth, understand all sides of a scenario and of a perspective, and use that to further whatever point you're trying to get across.
Yeah, I think for us, our information is one-sided, and it's the side that is not elevated. It's the side that's not really included in the mainstream conversation. So, and I think that's what all of our shows do, right? We're really about this perspective, these voices that are not in the mainstream conversation. And I think, not to say that, I think misinformation is highly problematic. I think that part of what is important is that we are building a community of people who our listeners can turn to and see as trusted sources, not just us, right? I feel like I'm just a conduit to guide people to great places. And hopefully we are part of facilitating more critical thinking, right? I know for me, as much as I am one-sided in my perspective as the host, the idea is for people to have some critical thinking. Our listeners, I think, our audience is really geared towards frontline environmental justice, committed and oriented advocates. But I know that we have other people on the show who may not agree with what we talk about. However, we hope that those listeners open up to another perspective. And so I think part of it is having that discourse. So the challenge with misinformation is that it is more of a propaganda strategy. And for us, it's to embrace that value of critical thinking, to allow people to try to absorb. So when I think about a topic, it's not just the describing of the topic or the introduction to the work, but I feel like I try to channel the listeners about where are the soft spots, like where can I push, where can I pull, so that at the end of the show, all of us have moved along, versus I have someone who I just have invited because I want them to convince all of our listeners of a certain perspective. So I think if we go back to that orientation or that position of like, it's okay for us to, deepen our thinking and have some disagreements, but for people to be open, then I feel good about the show, even though I hope that everyone lands where I am. It's not really the objective of what I'm trying to do.
I'd love to jump in here for a second. I think that piece about critical thinking is so important to part of like the ethos of my podcast, because I often felt that, right, like I was coming off the heels of being in a classroom setting. And I often found that even within these intimate educational settings, people felt like they couldn't really share their perspective. And there are so many questions involved with the climate transition. And so my goal was exactly what you said, not to convince people of something, but to ask more questions. Because at the end of the day, we don't even have all the answers yet. And there are so many different facets of the energy transition and the climate, like just all of these different questions related to how we're going to get there from a technological perspective, from a cultural perspective. And so I wanted to feel like people could come into this space and ask questions, and so that there's dialogue within this safe space, because I feel like I don't even have all the answers, right? Like, and we're deeply involved in this work. So I think just continuing to have critical thinking as like that underlying tone is really important for misinformation, everything.
I think you all do a great job as climate experts of weaving in the joy and hope and pop culture in your show and lively conversations that just make it really engaging and fun to listen to, yet you're still learning so much. How are you thinking about weaving in sort of the creativity, humor, joy, and optimism that keeps listeners engaged? And have you experienced, feedback from listeners that sharing kind of the joy, which we love in the Joy Report and in all of your shows, that help foster community around climate action?
I think before I answer that, I want to add on to the last point. Such an important part of environmental justice and climate justice work is helping cultivate self-determination for the communities that are most impacted by these problems. And I feel like when you're providing resources and opportunity and education and avenues for people to learn more and learn processes, then you are contributing to that. And so, yeah, I just thought it was important to add that there. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. Thank you.
I was asking how you're thinking about, in your storytelling, weaving in creative, joyful, hopeful elements in addition to just sharing the knowledge and the facts, those elements, I think, that bring sort of a unique voice and spirit to each of your shows.
Yeah, I think accessibility is important. And I think ultimately, people aren't gonna want to listen if it's not fun or entertaining or engaging, right? When you have countless options out there, what sets you apart is how you deliver a message. And so for the Joy Report, we focus on telling positive climate stories, because we have found that so many young people are just overcome with climate doom. For the first time in history, we are seeing psychologists now having to be trained in how to deal with and support people through climate doomism. And we've also found that climate doom really stuns people into inaction, right? And we just don't have time for that. And so in order for us to effectively move the needle and invite people into this movement, we incorporate music into the podcast, and the stories are really positive, and we try to make it as engaging as possible, and using social media as promotional material material and kind of like working both of those together is helpful?
I started filming them in person. I think it made a big difference. I did my podcast virtually for many years, and then I decided to like start doing it in person, and it just created a whole different energy to the conversation because I realized that like doing it virtually is great, but I think you can't beat, human interaction like face to face. And so when I started doing it and recording it in person with people, and I actually Kiki was on my podcast and came to my house here on the East Coast. And literally like I had to like design my living room, and I just like kind of like set up the camera and like had people just come over to my little apartment. And these are people I'd never met before in person, but we knew each other through LinkedIn or like social media, who are incredible leaders in the environmental space. And all of a sudden it went from like, okay, yeah, like these are incredible leaders and they're well known for their work. And now they're like having tea with me at my house and like are just like sitting on my couch and we're like talking. And I think there's something about that I really enjoy, and is probably something I'm going to continue to prioritize. And I only started doing that like in the past year, and I've had this show for like almost 6 years now at this point. And I realized like, yeah, those moments of like getting to like make eye contact with someone and laugh or like hug them or like even cry during an episode, and you getting to like watch that. Because I do record it like live on like I use Riverside. I know you were gonna ask that later on what we use, but yeah, I use Riverside, and it's great because I can like record live video as well as audio, and so you actually get to see how I'm connecting with the person. And I think that creates a whole new element of like, oh wow, this information seems really like intense and academic, but like, oh, I actually see the person's face. I'm actually getting to know them. I'm feeling like you two are connecting. I'm seeing your dynamic, and it adds in this whole new element that makes you feel like you're also there and like you're a part of the conversation, and that like it's not scary. I'm not like you're not alone, and like that these experts, are there to like help guide you through that too.
Yeah, I think we wanted to kind of talk a bit about the logistics of podcasting, because it can feel really daunting. Like, do I have solo episodes? Do I have guest episodes? How do I incorporate music? Like, do I have to understand like production and sound? And so I think, we kind of already started talking about that, but I'd love to hear more about how that process has evolved, because I think sometimes you start to realize, with some of your stats and just getting feedback from your listeners, like what works, what doesn't work. So maybe everyone can like go around and share a bit about that process.
I can start again. Yeah, like when I was first starting out, like, I bought my first microphone, and I remember that being like so expensive. Like back then I was like, because I did it right when I was graduating college. And I remember even having like $100 microphone. I was like, what? Like, that's like all my money for the month or something. Yeah, it was expensive, and obviously like later on I learned from, pretty like professional people, it doesn't have to be that expensive if you figure out the right things. But at first it was like, oh, if you really want to sound legit, you need to buy this microphone, you need to have this editing software and all these things. And yeah, I mean, I did it really DIY because I couldn't afford a podcast editor or producer. Like, again, did this straight out of college. And so, yeah, I was editing my own podcast myself, taking every micro edit and second. And I remember I would just like lock myself in my like college room in the dark. And I said, you can't leave until you finish editing. And I remember that being so miserable, and I hated it. And it made me want to give up podcasting altogether, because taking out the ums and oh my God. I just remember those days. Never want to go back. Luckily now I have people who edit it. But like, yeah, like when I was first starting out, I did that stuff by myself, went on the YouTubes, studied how to do it. And like now we have all these amazing AI tools and things to make your podcast editing so much faster and easier. But those things just didn't exist back then. But yeah, like I would say that like as time went on, like I realized that like I was such a perfectionist starting out though. Like I said, was such a perfectionist that took me forever to release an episode. And then I learned that like eventually I was like, you have to put out these episodes. And I was just really scrappy with it. I remember it was these incredible episodes just about like, talking about different incredible bold Black leader is like leading, nature movements and like getting more folks in the outdoors. And I put those out there, and I honestly thought it was terrible quality. Obviously, I'm a perfectionist, so I'm very hard on myself. And they went viral. Like, they got so many listens, and like actually NYU put it in their official directory of like environmental justice education. So like, it was crazy. Like, I didn't expect that, but it was because I just put, yeah. And then I learned, I was like, wait, I could do this a bit scrappier. So I kind of like was like, okay, like maybe I leave some ums in there. Maybe I don't have the best soundscape set design of like my show, but the content was good. And I realized like, and I learned that from content creation in general. Like, I'm a full-time content creator outside of podcasting with video and blog. And I learned that like sometimes it's okay to just like put out the shitty thing. I don't know if you're allowed to say. Put out the not as great, put out the not as great, put out the not as great quality thing. And I learned that, and then I got faster at putting out the podcast, where it was like, okay, maybe I don't need to do an hour and a half. I could do 30 minutes. Then I got to like 15 minutes because people's attention spans are short. And if it's not going to be the best quality, maybe make it shorter. So actually, the show now is like way shorter than it was when I started out. I keep it now to like only like 30 minutes max. And I know it's not going to be like the best editing, but I know the content's good. And so I've kind of like scrapped the idea of like, okay, my show's not going to be like the most professionally sounding, but I know people are going to listen to it because they want the content. So I learned, so for me, at least that has worked because I just have a really engaged audience online, period. And luckily the podcast has become just kind of like a side part of that. Whereas I know some people, it's like the podcast is their main thing and then they have to build out of that. But for people out there that are like very in their heads of like, format needs to be this long, whatever, I would say like honestly start out short and then go to long form, because I think if you start out short and you do that enough times, it'll reduce your like perfectionism and barrier to entry to eventually get to like a much longer in-depth thing where you actually understand what is your tone, what is your voice, what is your format. Okay, now we can go deeper, rather than like vice versa, in my opinion. That's my 2 cents.
Clearly, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. You might hear a very polished episode and not seeing all the hours editing, hopefully not in the dark, but definitely challenges as shows that are completely independently produced, like some of ours are, I know, particularly when it comes to accessing funding too, and already like, as a woman in media. But I'm very curious to hear also about, Aiko and Arielle, your production processes, particularly since both of your shows are part of incredible environmental nonprofits, and how having a little bit more of a team maybe changes what that production looks like for the shows.
That's a great question. There's no way I could do the podcast without an amazing team. So Taylor Ward and Angel Bautista from our team really just do extraordinary work on the sort of, getting the speakers ready, to the editing, to the promotion. And so for me, I get to sort of, be the host. And so I can focus on that. And so for us, on your prior question, the podcasts that seem to have the highest listeners are the most nerdy podcasts we have. So the more technical the content, for some reason, the more people want to listen to it. So when we talk about nuclear energy and environmental justice, when we talk about carbon capture and environmental justice, those are the ones that people want to listen to. And I don't know why, but my guess, part of it is that I am the least technical content person in our organization. My job is not necessarily know how all those pieces work, right? It's to run the organization. And so for me, when I'm on those shows and sort of the thinking of me hosting it, because I was very resistant, this is not my thing to normally do. And I'm not necessarily the demographic that we're going for here, but because I think there's that sense that we have as just being very curious. And when the technical experts come on, they're just things that I'm like, I don't really understand what that is. Like, how does that work? And I feel like I get to ask all the sort of dumb questions, right? The questions that people may be more afraid to ask, because it feels like we should be more knowledgeable about these things, which makes no sense, right? Who needs to be technically aware of how nuclear energy works? Like, none of us, really. But we need to understand, when we do that, what does it mean for community? What are the potential implications? What does it mean historically? What does it mean going forward? And so for me, I think part of that is that I get to ask someone and to try to move them from this very technical in their brain space to the like, but tell me, what does that mean to me today, to us listening on the show? And so somewhat, I think, not being so weighted by the production process allows me to have that sort of creative space. And so that's why I'm really grateful. Our nonprofit does not have any funding to do the podcast specifically. And I think we've talked about the downside is we are then subsequently bound by that. Like, I am dying to do a podcast before election and I can't touch it as a charitable nonprofit. So there is the benefit of having some of that, capacity and support, but we don't have the freedom per se, and it is sort of tied to the programmatic objective of the organization. So I think for us, we really have been discussing like, what are the merits of it being independent? What are the merits of it being connected to an institution with resources? It's a tough call.
That's interesting. I think one of the benefits that, especially in the beginning of being tied to an organization that has like a very large social media presence, is that we could use the data from like specific topics to identify what we wanted our first season to be about. And so that almost guaranteed higher engagement on those episodes because we already knew that that's what our audience liked. So that was extremely helpful. And then in terms of like actual production process, it's been like phenomenal to have like an audio engineer who just like does that for us. And having a producer whose job it is to like identify the ums and be like, okay, please like remove that from it. And so I feel very fortunate that has been my experience, but I will say that because it's so polished, it limits the amount of episodes that come out. And so I think we're always trying to figure out ways to like strike that balance in a more intentional way and try to be timely with our issues and try, even when we're not focusing an episode on an issue that is like extremely relevant, to still include elements of relevant climate news in the episode, no matter what, because it's important for people to know things, right? And so I think ultimately the goal is to share and spread information and to empower people. And so I feel like with an organization, there are benefits. I think doing it independently has benefits. I think seeking sponsors and funders for particular episodes is something that we've been exploring at IE. And so we for this second season, we've been working with Keen, the like outdoor footwear company, to do some episodes on like circularity in textiles and like those types of things. So we found that has been an interesting and unique opportunity to marry like maybe things that are aligned with a particular organization and things that we know that our audience really likes to learn about.
Yeah, I want to add on to the idea of sponsorship because I have had experience with that. I really tried to figure out like how I could, make sure my episodes didn't seem too addy. But it was cool because there was a few organizations like Earth Justice and Mercy Corps and a few other organizations that I've worked with over the years where I was able to just explore doing like a multiple part series and weave it into like a bigger content package where I was just like, okay, like I really want to dive into an expert that's in your network to both highlight the work, but to do it through proper storytelling rather than me just saying, okay, great, this episode's sponsored by this organization, buy their thing. Even though there's a time and a place for that and there's plenty of shows that do that, I thought organically weaving that in would be nice. And a lot of organizations were really down for that, which is really cool. And I think it helped a lot because it was like, the podcast is a bit more experimental. Obviously I have some guaranteed listenership and like return listeners, but I think it was cool because it was like, there's video elements to my show, there's audio. So I think a lot of organizations really like gravitated towards wanting to sponsor a show that combined those two things, just for people out there that might be interested.
Yeah, that's great. I think if we're okay on time, just wanted to ask what has been the most inspiring and favorite show that you've recorded so far, whether it's like because it really made you laugh or cry or just something that really sticks into your mind of like this is why I do this. Like, this is one of the best parts of podcasting for me.
While you're thinking about that, I just want to say I loved what you were sharing about the really technical episodes doing the best. So I'll maybe add to that, or like, what is something you've learned? Because you're all experts in what you do, and the climate field is so vast, and your shows cover a large breadth of topics, and the industry is constantly and rapidly changing and evolving. And you also cover issues such as, policy and changes in technology. So perhaps it's a favorite episode or just something you've learned, because I can speak for myself and say I think I've learned so much from every single one of my guests, which is, I think, maybe the greatest gift of doing the show, in addition to being able to bring that to other people. And I will also just say that I've had you all on as guests, so go listen to those episodes. Kristy's and Arielle's are already out from season 1, and Aiko's is coming very soon in season 2. And Deanna and I also recorded a collaborative episode that is coming soon. So small plug. You have lots to listen to now when you go home between all of these shows. So, yeah.
It is hard to pick one episode. It's every single one. I'm just absolutely blown away with the people out there. And that's where the inspiration comes from. Even if they're talking about heavy topics, they are still trying to solve them. And that just makes me feel just better. So many shows. I will say there's one show where I felt like I just wasn't going to talk at all. I felt like I had nothing to add, which actually we haven't aired yet, is an interview I recently did with the Navajo Nation, who talked about just the impact of uranium ore mining on lands that was such an awful situation, historically, currently, and that the situation is going to get worse again because we're in our focus on carbon fundamentalism, that we are reopening the door to nuclear energy, and just hearing the story of how their land has been damaged, how their health and families have been damaged. And there's the historic damage that hasn't been fixed. And now, we're sort of going back down that path in very aggressive ways. And I think during that show, it was one of the shows where I just felt like I couldn't talk, both because the speaker was extraordinary, but it was just so deeply troubling, and that the solution was not evident. Like the rest of the shows we had sort of curated around this, like, okay, we had this problem and here's this person who's got a solution and they're fixing it. I think when we actually do go into there's not necessarily a happy ending. That one was one that I just sort of have been struggling with our production team, saying, because I just stopped asking questions because I didn't want to interrupt. And I was like, I don't know where to go here, because it's just all just horrifying. And so I think it was memorable. And my favorite, which you would think that was one where it's like, oh, I taped it perfectly. And you started with a problem and you wrapped it at the end, and it all was a beautiful bow at the end. It was probably my favorite because it was just so much like, well, what do we do with that? Like, how do we, in a 20-minute show, kind of drop that bomb and then just like, okay. So I think it's those moments that I scratch my head and think, okay, this is like the power and the responsibility of what we are doing that kind of hit me a little harder than most of the other shows that I've done. No.
So what I love about the Joy Report, probably more than anything, is the opportunity to showcase radical imagination in real time. And we have an episode focusing on radical imagination that we did with Grist during season 1. That was wonderful. I loved taking a full left turn and just doing a full episode on book bans and how that relates to environmental justice as a book nerd myself. I have also, I think in season 1, we did an episode on ecosystem restoration, and we highlighted an organization called Diving with a Purpose, and they train like Black people to scuba dive and then do like coral restoration work and like archaeological like research underwater to like identify remains of slave ships. And so it's just like really, really powerful. And I love the opportunity to do that type of stuff. And one episode that I am like really excited about for season 2, we just released one on like funding and radically reimagining funding for the climate movement and like talking about disparities, talking about what it would look like to have new models that like more adequately fund and contribute to solutions, and recognizing that like funding is the greatest barrier for us being able to achieve a lot of the things that we want to do. So that was a long answer with a lot of answers, but that's my answer.
I would say like my 2 favorites that just popped in my head now, but I also feel the same. I've loved every guest and I've loved every subject I've ever covered over the years but it's feeling more relevant recently is my episode that is about the connections between like prisons and climate, and it's with the organization Fight Toxic Prisons, and we talk about the connections between folks who are incarcerated living on the front lines of heat and rising waters and things like that, and just like the poor conditions they have to live within, because I had yet to see many podcasts or shows talk about specifically how that population is being impacted and disenfranchised when it comes to the climate crisis. And so I really liked that episode because I didn't know much about what that looks like. I think there's a lot of maybe populations or work that I've done in the past where I understood those things, but that was like an area of expertise where it was like, I don't even know how you possibly approach that from, addressing it through like an abolitionist lens. So that was interesting. And then the other series that I really enjoyed was my deep sea mining series. So I did a 3-part series exploring the concept of deep sea mining, which for people who don't know is the practice of going deep, deep into the depths of the ocean to literally destroy the last bits of, oceanic ecosystems we have in search of rare minerals that are going to go into different technologies. And there's a lot of countries around the world illegally starting to explore that. And I worked with an organization to do a 3-part series where I interviewed someone who actually understood the financing, so actually the global financing structures and where the interventions could happen in that space. I interviewed an international scientist, like marine scientist, who talked about the science and harm behind deep sea mining. And then I interviewed an incredible indigenous activist who actually is living in one of the island territories that's being threatened by deep sea mining, and talking about why she feels passionate of living on the front lines of deep sea mining. And so I really love that series because it takes one issue but brings 3 different vantage points together to all pretty much send the same message that this ish need to be banned. So yeah, I really like those 2 concepts.
Yeah, I think for me, the person that I interviewed wasn't Latin or female, but I had the privilege of interviewing Kim Stanley Robinson for my podcast. And honestly, it was really funny. Like was connected to him through an old professor, my undergrad. And we had to schedule it out like months in advance because he was so busy. And I remember it was like a Saturday. And he's been in the climate space for like decades. And I was just so astounded by just the wisdom he had. I think the conversation, like the way that he sort of framed the way that he got into writing about climate was more through the lens of science fiction that then kind of morphed into writing about kind of climate science fiction. It became a genre as he was writing. And so he really talked about how climate change for our generation is like, he compared it to the civil rights movement for his generation. And he sort of kind of framed it to me in this way that was like, if you feel like you don't have a purpose, this is your purpose. And so for me, it was one of those conversations where I just like really took a step back and was like, this is the why of why we're doing all of this. And it was just such an inspirational conversation and has really stuck with me. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, I've had the pleasure of already listening to some of the episodes you mentioned, but go listen to all these episodes. They're incredible, and looking forward to the one that hasn't come out yet. All right, I think we'll do maybe kind of one more question and then open it up to all of you for any questions. Yeah, I think in closing, how are you hoping to see the impact of your show on moving your goals of supporting climate justice forward? And what are you looking forward to in all that's to come with your show? I know it sounds like there's things that have been recorded and not released yet, and you are all visionaries. So, kind of, what are your visions for how these shows will continue to move forward and have a positive impact? Because storytelling is so important. I think what continues to come through in everything you've shared is it's more than just the information you're sharing in the shows. It's whether if it's narrative, kind of that story you're crafting through the script to create an emotional connection with your listeners. And for the interview shows, the connections that you are having with the guests are really powerful, and contribute just as much as the facts and information themselves. So how is this carrying forward in your vision for the future?
Well, I'm hoping in the future we all get to do another show again. I think that would be a lot of fun. And I think that for me, because of the extraordinary community organizing and activism that's been happening out there around environmental justice, we are seeing policymakers and electeds actually welcoming more the input of community and at least signaling and sometimes statutorily allowing communities to have a greater voice. And that's been really important on this point of self-determination. So for me, I think looking forward is to the extent that for us, we can give people the information to be strong advocates, to be able to go into those meetings and feel like they have the technical expertise and support that they need to be able to engage in those conversations. So I think if we can, the future is a little unknown. I'll just leave it there as a charitable nonprofit. And so, either whatever the future brings, come this November, our work, still continues. We are looking not only broadly at our, survival as humans and the planet and all living creatures, but also the political civil rights movement that we're in on all those fronts. Incarcerated individuals, Indigenous folks, BIPOC folks broadly, to be able to have the ability to shape their future and to have, clean water, healthy food, clean air, opportunity, all those things that we know are fundamental and important. And our work is far from over. We are at a inflection point in the US in terms of how much we continue to advance those and how much we are back on our heels in a defensive posture. And so I think what I look for in the future is the ability for our platforms to continue to advance the discourse, to be able to raise the challenges, the sort of successes, but also to be able to deepen understanding of what we need to do and really what's at risk. And so I'm hoping that we all keep working together to just cover all the bases. There's so many issues. There's so many amazing people. Because it takes a while to produce, we do have to do a lot of work. And so I'm excited to be connected through this panel with everyone so we can begin figuring out okay, you got that covered, I've got that covered. And I'm trying to convince everyone to do a post-election podcast. And that'd be great to hear us talking about what we think about the outcome of the election and what the future looks like and things like that would be great. So it's just I'm hoping the future brings us together more.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think I'm looking forward to this podcast and all the podcasts represented here to continue empowering those who feel voiceless, those who feel hopeless, those who just haven't been able to be as involved in this movement as they want to be. In the first season, the Joy Report reached over 60 countries, and I recognize the immense value and privilege of that. I recognize that in the United States, we still can protest, right? It's one of the few places in the world where we're actually able to go out and not risk our lives, and of course there are people who are risking their lives in this fight, but I think the ability to protest is actually technically protected. It's a protected right in this country, which I think is an opportunity, and it provides an option, and it provides empowerment. And so I hope that more people learn from the podcasts. I hope that they talk about these issues more. I hope that these podcasts will give people the language necessary to make to integrate climate into more conversations. I find that there's still a really big disconnect about who feels like they can talk about climate. And I think now more than ever, we need everyone to be talking about climate. And so I hope that these podcasts will continue to give people the language, even if they haven't studied the environment for years and years and years, to feel like they can be a part of solutions and be a part of these conversations.
Yeah, I would say that, just echoing what everyone already said, I would say podcasts serve as a tool for people that want to just more passively consume content. I think there's a huge opportunity because a lot of the social media content we're consuming is so fast paced and 5 seconds and your brain's fried. And so it's I think podcasting is this exciting new opportunity for people to get back into the vibe of longer form content, to maybe go deeper on a subject. And I've always really appreciated and loved podcasting for that reason. Just because I think it's the one space where it's okay, I do have an hour, I'm going on a walk, I'm on a train or whatever, I can actually sit down and listen to this. And not have to actively be on my phone having to read through everything and be overstimulated. And so I think podcasting has the opportunity for people to slow down. And I think that's inherently more sustainable and environmental in nature. So I'd say podcasting is a more sustainable media consumption tool, in my opinion, compared to other forms, even though I do it all. But I would say podcasting actually, you gotta sit down, you gotta listen. You can't, but then you can also do other things. You can live your life, but it's there. Whereas I think a lot of the things we're consuming outside in the world, it's it's right in your face. You have to be there right there. So I think it's a metaphor for how we should all be living and consuming. So I'd say the future of podcasting is maybe the future of environmentalism and how we're all engaging with each other. Mic drop.
Yeah.
Love that.
So fun.
The last thing I'll say before we wrap, I think for me, the future for my podcast is surrounded around language access. So anecdotally, when I went to COP26 in Glasgow, there's one of the days is Youth Day. And so one of the things that I noticed was how much of a language barrier there is throughout the whole thing, which is so ironic because it's the UN, the UNFCCC, and how so many of the events, materials weren't in Spanish, French, other languages represented in the UN. So one of my main things is having more episodes in Spanish and having a bilingual podcast to make this information accessible to so many people who speak Spanish around the world, who are deeply involved in the climate space. So much of what's happening in the US is happening in Central and South America. A lot of the transition affects critical minerals, things happening in these countries. And so broadening, the conversation around environmental and climate justice into these spaces. So, I'll just wrap with that.
Appreciate you all so much. I could keep chatting all day, but before we open it up to questions, yeah, go ahead. was going to say, before we open it up to questions, could you just let people know again where they can find your shows or follow your work more broadly so they can hear more of your beautiful voices?
Yeah, so you can find Palma Podcast. It's Palma_podcast on Instagram. I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and yeah, it's all there.
You can check out the Brown Girl Green podcast. It's just called Brown Girl Green, wherever you listen to your shows. And the episodes are also on browngirlgreen.com and the Brown Girl Green podcast and youtube.com/browngirlgreen.
So you can find the Joy Report on Apple or Spotify, and also on Intersectional Environmentalists' website. So you can also just follow them at Intersectional Environmentalist, and you can follow me at Arielle V. King. Thanks.
Our podcast, same locations. It's called Just Solutions Podcast, and you can learn about all of our work at justsolutionscollective.org.
I hope you all have your phones out and are already following all of them. Feel free to come find us if you need to repeat any of that. But let's give it up for our amazing panelists. Thank you so much, everyone. And with that, I'll open it up if there's any questions.
Thank you. My question is about the bilingual aspect and having episodes in different languages. Do you find you need to create another kind of marketing strategy to get those episodes in front of the right people? Or how would you kind of try to push those episodes to the right demographic so that they can find it?
Yeah, totally. So one of the episodes I did fully in Spanish was I interviewed the head of sustainability at Flor de Caña, which is a rum company based in Nicaragua, which is where my family is from. And I think 100%, I think there's there's a huge demographic of Hispanic folks here in the US, but I do find that some of the conversations that are happening in Central and South America are a little bit different and have different sort of audiences in the sense of the issues related to EJ and climate justice are more nuanced. So I think as I continue to think about what conversations I want to bring to the table, I want to do my own homework so that I understand the nuances. Because one of my biggest pet peeves is a lot of the discussions about these issues, at least in the States, is it kind of feels very broad. And so I want to make sure that I'm very specific about the issues that are happening in these countries. So I think going forward, that's something that I definitely want to do, of understanding who are the players in different countries and like stakeholders, because thinking about, for example, like the recent election in Mexico, I found the conversation extremely interesting about not only the first female president in Mexico, but somebody who has deep involvement within the climate space, and how even within my own Mexican friends, that there were different opinions. And so wanting to bring that out and have more of a nuanced conversation, I think is kind of like where I want to be. Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys so much for that. My name's Nina. I'm a recent grad with a master's now in climate change sciences. And while you guys were all speaking, there were themes about what a typical climate scientist looks like, and also just generally starting out in the space, and like themes about perfectionism. So I guess I'm wondering if you could, and this is to everyone, go back to your younger self when you were starting specifically in climate generally, and I suppose in podcasting. What would you say to that younger, more novice version of yourself?
I need time to think back that far.
I would have said don't be a perfectionist for sure. I think, like I said, I wasted a lot of time just being in my own head and thinking something wasn't good enough, to where it took me months to put something out. And yeah, there was really good content there, and it stopped me, it slowed me down. And I could have had so many more episodes I put up, could have done so many other things if I just got out of my head and just did it. And I'm glad, because eventually I did do that. And then, now like I am doing what I do now. And so it's like, I feel like I always tell myself like, you are living proof of like the destiny you're building for yourself. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, you don't have to compare yourself to other people or like where they're at in their journey or like, oh, I'm late to the game or, oh, like these things already exist. It's like, I think just get started and I think be persistent. And I think those two things and not getting caught up in your head with perfectionism is really key.
I would probably tell my younger self to take up more space. I think as a little Black girl in the climate movement, I was told to not take up space, right? Like, and I felt like I couldn't. And I think that limited my like comfort, especially very early on in like voicing my opinion and understanding that like, because of who I am, my unique set of experiences and the perspective that I can add just from being who I am is so valuable. And it's actually so needed in so many rooms. And so I would just like tell myself to take up more space and like to like confront people when they're saying ridiculous things. Like actually, I'll never forget, I'm like my freshman year of college, I'm in like an environmental ethics class, and like the professor has us read this essay of like comparing animal cruelty in the food system to chattel slavery in the United States, and being like, yeah, it's the same impact, it's the same, like all these things. And like as the only Black person in the room, I like felt so disempowered, right? And I was like, and that was like so harmful. And I feel like in that moment, it was easy to just kind of like cave into myself because I was scared, right? And I think in retrospect, I would have wanted to like call him out in person. Like, I don't know, I would have wanted to use my voice and talk about how wrong that perspective is more publicly. So, yeah.
See. I think the only thing I'd add is to when you're in this space, the more that you're grounded in community, the better. Because I think this topic can become so cerebral and so esoteric in the sense that, I think in this day and age, which is a whole other show, I think we are currently moving towards an obsession with technology and sort of Silicon Valley sort of saving us all from the planet, right? The decline of the planet. And so I think that if you have that scientific technical training, which is so amazing, right, and such a privilege to be able to obtain, is to find out how you can be close with community, to be in service to community, because I think that sort of tethering yourself in that way will keep you in a place where you will have authentic impact, because that is really where it's going to come from. That's really where it has to come from, is that the communities in particular that are disproportionately impacted are leading and are thinking about the work, and they often need people who have that privilege of having gone to get a higher education to support them and help them to make their ideas become reality. Not to create the idea for them, but to have that scientific training to say, the thing that you want to accomplish actually will have the impact that you think it will. It's not to, it's to be in that service and in that partnership that I think ultimately you do well. If you are driven by ego or personal gain or getting published or being famous, like we do not need any of that. We've got plenty of that. So I think that's sort of where we want to be, right? So it's great. Congratulations that you've accomplished that.
I think with podcasting, it can feel like you're kind of screaming into the void sometimes, like with listeners not wanting longer content, due to like shorter attention spans, and you've had to like kind of craft your messaging so that it impacts people, and it's felt. It's like what has been some of like the greatest examples of like how your podcast, you saw the direct impact like of an episode. Like, did that turn into like some really cool project that you worked on or some really great collaborations? Did it change someone's mind? Did it like change a policymaker's mind? Like, what was the like greatest impact you saw from your work?
I really like that question. I would say the episode that I was talking about that was like featured in different classrooms was the episode It came out in 2020, and it was after Christian Cooper, the black birder, was called on by the police for bird watching in Central Park here in New York. And, it was huge controversy, obviously, like, got crazy coverage. And I actually, like, did the episode connecting that with other, like, environmental justice leaders who were doing work in Detroit and other spaces, talking about, like, what is, like, the future of, like, the environmental justice movement in this moment, as we're seeing, racial injustice happening all over the world. And it's been happening, but, like, people are having this reckoning, or this, like, wake up moment. And I remember, like, again, I didn't expect so many, like, people to, like, listen to it, but then, a lot of teachers thought of it as, like, a really great, like, 101 on, like, teaching, their students about environmental justice, specifically from leaders in the space, while also having it in the context of something that was happening with current events. And that, I think that showed me that, like, as much as, like, it's great to, like, produce a show that could be evergreen, honestly, I think the most impactful podcast episodes, at least in my experience, the ones that have gotten the most engagement and feedback has been very current event driven, which has actually encouraged me to, like, want to get back into making a weekly series. Again, not super polished, but, like, just putting out, like, this is what happened this week, and, like, let's talk about it. And a lot of people have asked me for that over the years, and I think that that episode, when that happened, it created a lot of conversations to where they even made, like, these teachers made, like, a module out of it and, like, asked questions and got student feedback. And, like, that was really cool, because it was like, wow, like, my episode is being used as part of, like, a pedagogy for environmental justice in classrooms. Like, that felt really, really impactful, for sure.
Similarly, I've received feedback from a lot of professors who have, like, integrated the podcast into their work. I would say primarily episodes related to renewable energy, because we, like, talk about it in a very accessible way and, like, talk about solutions in a very clear way. And also all of the episodes are under 30 minutes, so it does, like, appeal to the limited attention spans of most students. So.
I don't know yet. Our podcast is, we have one season, sort of new to this. I think that there are a couple of things to think about. One is, I think that often the impact is with the guests. I think it is true that a lot of guests that we have on struggle with imposter syndrome, right? It's like, oh, why am I on your show? Like, am I really, like, that important? And so I think just that work that we do to validate their leadership, and often just the conversation of bringing them forward and helping them see how important they are, how much they have to offer the work and the movement. I think the second thing I'll say is, podcasting is such a new tactic in the body of social movements, right? For me, community organizing, direct action, social activity in terms of mobilizing and engaging community, to me, is fundamental, right? The podcast, and especially a 20-minute podcast, isn't, I don't think will create social change, right? It's going to take those deeper elements that historically have created the political pressure to actually, create the change that we need to see on the scale that we need to. But can the podcast play a role in other ways to support that, right? To be able to bring people's thinking to a particular place, to deepen their understanding, to bring other voices into the space. So I do think, to me, there's this blend of, like I said before, I have my own opinion and I get to curate our show with our team, which is just amazing. But it is sort of a question at this point of, like, what is the role of podcasts in particular? How do we, I'm very mindful, become complicit in some of the sort of, maybe it's hard to discern sometimes, like, the information and, like, what are we doing here and what is the solution and who is the right person to have as the speaker. So I think for us, it's the danger of not being complicit in sort of the greenwashing or putting up certain messages or speakers. And so I think that's the hard part, is that as BIPOC identified women, we have this privilege, and I think there's a little bit of, like, deeper thinking that I have been going through about, well, what is what is our responsibility and how do you begin to live that out? And unlike large institutional communication efforts, right, who have sponsors and advertisers and producers who are trying to make sure they get listeners, we do have that freedom that I try not to think too much about who our listeners are, because I do think it starts to make you be like, oh, we want more listeners. And that's always the danger. And thinking like, what do our listeners need, want to hear? Maybe we'll create shows that get more listeners. So I think there is something about that freedom. But I think there's also this question of like, what is our role in social movements? Like, what is our place and what are we doing in that way that I think is still a little unclear for me, but it's fun to do in the meantime.
I will just add briefly, I think there's many impacts, but one that's felt meaningful to me is messages I've gotten from listeners saying things like, hey, I'm also a woman of color who works in the energy space, and listening to this made me feel less alone. I think like those kinds of messages I've gotten have felt the most meaningful to me. Just knowing that you might really just like touch one person out there, and who knows what that inspires them to go out and do. And hopefully it's more than just one person, but yeah, I think it's beautiful to see kind of the ripple of impact. And also it's brought all of us together here in person, not just, behind the mics apart. So grateful for that. I think maybe we could take one more quick question and then we'll close out.
Thank you. I guess basically my question is, and I think you started to speak to it, but how do you all contend with the fact that this is both a movement, but really also a massive industry, climate, and even like Climate Week itself is backed by, huge banks and funders. Majority of the events are about fundraising. And I think about this question because of, you spoke about one podcast, I missed their name, but they said that this was like the biggest movement since civil rights. But environmental justice is civil rights. It's just a continuation of civil rights. But I think at this point, it affects everybody on this earth. So folks have to participate and be concerned. I just think a lot about how this movement is a movement, but also one that is like bolstered by billions and billions of dollars. And that for us to like do events and to do our work, we have to have sponsors. So, I guess what boundaries do you create within that work for yourselves as individuals for self-preservation, but also preservation of a movement?
Question. This is a really important one. I think all of us have shared how podcasting is a tool, right? And it's one of many to be able to achieve options for accessible education. I think for the Joy Report and for IE in general, like we are really mindful about who we seek out for sponsorships, and we prioritize and only work with mission-aligned companies, which limits how much funding we can get, right? But it also it prioritizes and demonstrates to our audiences and to ourselves that we have like clear non-negotiables about like who we want to be in community with. So I guess that's one way that we go about it. And then we also recognize the value of collaboration. And so like as much as we can, we want to like add in the perspectives and voices of other like organizations and uplift other organizations so we can use our platform to amplify the work of others who might not have that level of access and platform. So like the lifting up as we climb tactic is one that we use often.
I love that. I would echo that. I think collaboration has been key, and like I've also like explored like just being a host on other podcasts. So like I've kind of moved in and out of a space like podcasting was a big part of like my work as a content creator, but ultimately like it really wasn't paying my bills, to be honest with you, like compared to sponsorship I get for like other forms of media. Like video just for me paid me a lot more than doing podcasting. So I just like naturally moved away from it. I still have my podcast, which is amazing. And honestly, this conversation inspired me to like really get back into a weekly series because I kind of just like release them in chunks. The podcast really was like an act of love and art. It was not my main income source. I think if it was, I'd be really stressed out because podcasting, like at least when I was starting out, like didn't really have a good return on investment because it was really based on listenership. And a lot of the collectives I was a part of had like really stringent requirements to have consistent listenership. And if you even went like 100 listeners below that, you were cut TF out. Like they're like, sorry, you're not in the collective anymore. And now you don't get affiliate money for your episodes. And so it's a ruthless industry, if I'm being honest with you, especially with the saturation of it. I know that this is a little ugly, but I just gotta be honest about it. I personally think podcasting is an act of love more than it is monetary compared to other things that I do as a content creator. But I would say how I've done it, because I do video and I do blog, I package the podcast into a bunch of other content I do. And that creates something interesting for clients and companies that I work with, where it's like, okay, the podcast is also a part of it where I'll interview an expert, I'll interview a leader, and like that gets to be a part of it as part of the thought leadership you're getting to showcase as an organization. And for me, every person or content creator has their through line. I don't work with fossil fuel companies, but I have worked with like bigger corporations like Meta and some other places that maybe some other people would be like, I would never work with them because of like data security or whatever. So if you're like a content creator, you have to decide what that line is. And I personally don't judge Black or brown creators for taking money from certain corporations. Because yeah, maybe that makes them a sellout, but also like that's how they get the freedom to say whatever the hell they want and they're not tied to an institution. And I think there's a lot of lack of nuance that the world doesn't see that is on the shoulders of content creators, especially Black and brown ones that are suppressed by the algorithm, that sometimes we don't have a choice. Like we have to sometimes take those brand deals because ultimately that gives us the autonomy to say whatever we want. Now, if someone takes a brand deal and you can tell that they are limiting what they're saying in their perspective, then I would say raise your eyebrows. But if they say straight up, hey, I took this money because that allows me the freedom to like say whatever political opinion I want, whatever, and this allows me to pay my bills. Personally, for me, I don't judge people for that. I know some other people are more purist about that, but I think we have to be honest that Black and brown people's content is getting suppressed. And because of that, that impacts the money that we make. And so there needs to be a balance between those things. But also, you as a creator have to decide what your through line is on what makes you like a sellout or not.
I think it's a great question. I think it's fundamental, is that as a nonprofit, right, part of the structure is that you do create a theory of change, right? And so that theory of change and your values and principles and that process that you go through helps to set the compass. And then I think the podcast for us in our particular approach is it's just an educational tactic. And so it's tied to sort of, what are we doing? And then organizationally, our role is positionally in support of community, right? So I know that when I express my opinion, which I try not to, it's recognizing that now I'm saying my opinion. But I think what you're asking more fundamentally is about the climate movement. And we can be reflective of it for sure, or we could go against it. And I think that going against it is very important because I do think that I feel like, and this is a whole other show, that in the last 6 months or more, maybe a couple of years now, we are moving towards a very like supercharged neoliberal, let's, like I said before, let's invest in clean energy technologies, many that are questionable. And we've really kind of started to seed, equity is declining. I think the George Floyd murder moment is going away, which we all knew it's gone. We all knew it lasted longer than I thought. And so the equity is like not necessary if your focus is about a bright and shiny, solution that's going to come in and save the day. Doesn't matter about what we think anymore, except a little during election season, right? But by and large, that's kind of where we are, and I think everyone is lining up on that. It's less about, I think, where we were even just a handful of years ago. It's quite remarkable. You're seeing a retraction on DEI. You're seeing, I mean, funders are retracting money for equity and justice work. So I do think that I have never been to Climate Week. This is the first time I came down on Tuesday. And I agree with you. We were talking more closed door meetings, more, focus on fundraising, a lot more corporate presence, a lot more conversation about industry and technological advances and how we can all get behind that. And as taxpayers, folks from the US, billions and billions of dollars in private investments with no real accountability return, right? So there's definitely something to that. And I think that the question is, what are all the vehicles that we can kind of reclaim the conversation? Because I actually think we're losing it. And in the winter, again, it's C3, not saying too much, in 2025, it's going to stay the course or it's going to be worse. And I think there's a big kind of X factor out there for sure. Literally an X factor out there, right?
Well, on that note, thank you all again so much for being here. Let's give it up one more time.
Thank you all. We really just appreciate you coming out again on the heels of Climate Week. It's been a long week, so get some rest. Please enjoy. Safe travels to anyone who has to get home. But thank you all.